keep being told, oh, they're really parades of lovely, well-meaning, middle-class Brits who just want the best for persecuted people. Well, yeah, there might be some people on those marches like that. There might even be quite a lot of them. But there are also quite a lot of Islamists. They started using the word genocide about Israel's response to the October 7th attack, literally on October 7th or 8th. Yeah, it might have gone a bit far when you got 2 dead Jews at synagogue on Yom Kippur. This attack was carried out by a guy called Jihad, the guy whose name translates as Jihad from Syria, who carried out jihad in Manchester.
Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Jonathan Sacerdoti. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Hi, Brendan. Great to be with you.
I should say welcome back. We've had you on a couple of times, spreading your wisdom about the question of Israel, the question of what's happening with Jews in Britain and in Europe, things you've been writing about for a long time now, but especially since 7th of October 2023. And we're heading to the second anniversary of that atrocity this week. So there's a lot I want to ask you about where things are at right now, 2 years on, but it would be remiss of me not to start with asking you about the Manchester attack and the thing that a lot of us thought was coming but dared not say it out loud. The attack on the synagogue, this Heaton Park synagogue in Manchester, in which 2 Jews died. What was your thoughts when you heard about that, when you saw the coverage of that? Is it something that you expected but hoped would never come?
Yes, it is. I mean, I'm not the only one to have said that. I think we've heard it quite a lot. But I actually remembered an interview I'd done, I think 10 years earlier. It just flashed back in my mind, which was just after the attack in Paris at the Hypercacher supermarket. And I went into Sky News back in the days when they still liked to interview me, and they asked me to comment on it. And I said something along the lines of, we all know it's coming here as well. And I'm sorry to say that, but it's time that our government, our police, all did what they need to do to make sure it doesn't happen here in the UK. Well, they didn't, because it happened. And I don't know why I remembered that interview, but I did, so all those years later. And I went back and looked it up, because I just thought, not that I was prophetic in some way. In fact, I wasn't patting myself on the back. I felt really disappointed that I and others, yourself included, hadn't managed to communicate this properly all that time back then, because it did seem so obvious that this will happen. I mean, let's be blunt about it. Islamic terrorism targets Jews, but it doesn't just target Jews. It targets Westerners, it targets Brits, it targets liberal people, it targets women, it targets gay people. And so I was worried about it then. Loads of us were worried about it then. We warned about it then. Not only did they not do anything to stop it, they actually made things so much worse. And the last 2 years in particular have seen that since October the 7th, and even more specifically, since the new Labour government took power, it's got even worse still, partly because not only was there the tolerance of these marches and parades, which have just been dens of anti-Semitism and pro-terrorist sentiment, but also the foreign policy of our government changed drastically to become even more anti-Israel than it had been under, say, David Cameron as the foreign secretary. We had David Lammy and Keir Starmer, and it just got worse and worse, to the point that I think it would have been surprising if there hadn't been some kind of anti-Semitic attack. And that's such a horrible thing to say, but that's really how it felt. And at the same time, just to bring it right back down, on a human level, as a fellow Brit, as a fellow Jew, I was devastated to hear that those people had been killed, just as I was devastated when I heard about the kids who were targeted in Manchester arena bombing at the Ariana Grande concert. And yes, of course, this time it struck even closer to home for me and so many Jewish people, because these were Jewish people targeted clearly because they're Jewish, whilst at prayer in a synagogue in Great Britain. And that makes people think, well, we're just not safe anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And on Yom Kippur as well, which just makes it even worse if that's possible. You wrote a piece on the day of the attack, I believe it was, saying that this didn't come from anywhere. This didn't come out of the blue. You've touched on that there in terms of how anti-Semitism has been brewing for some time in this country and across Europe, but it's really been turbocharged, I think, since 7th of October 2 years ago. Um, what are the events that took place over the past 2 years in particular that made you think things were getting harder and harder for Britain's Jews to such an extent that it was possible we were going to see an attack like this?
Yeah, I mean, I did write about it on the day, which might not seem remarkable for some people, but it was for me because on Yom Kippur I don't work. I actually go to synagogue. I stay there pretty much all day usually. But what happened was I got there around 9:30, and within half an hour I heard the news. It kind of made it through the grapevine through our security, and then I heard it from them, and I sort of hung around for a bit, and I just thought I can't be here while this has happened, and knowing that it will be something that's obviously a very important and massive news story, and um, I also knew that lots of people from our community wouldn't be willing to cover it on that day, and so I just went home and decided that to me, it was more important to work and to do that. And I did go back later in the day for the end of the service, and I must say it was a very poignant service for me, and I'm sure for many other people, because all these things focus the mind in a way that Yom Kippur also does. For, it's a very solemn day. Jews fast. We repent for our sins. We sort of take stock of the year past and make promises for the year to come and things like that. So yeah, absolutely. And when I did look back over the year before, the 2 years before, I did think about what has contributed to this, what has turbocharged it. And it seems so obvious to say it, but obviously it isn't obvious to everyone, or maybe it is and they don't care. So to be specific, those marches are a big culprit. They're not the only one, but if you go to them or you watch them or you know people who are going to them, sending you information from them, you know what's going on in them. So we keep being told, oh, they're really parades of lovely, well-meaning middle-class Brits who just want the best for persecuted people. Well, yeah, there might be some people on those marches like that. There might even be quite a lot of them, but there are also quite a lot of Islamists. There are also quite a lot of people chanting for the death of Jews, maybe not explicitly, though sometimes, but often using phrases which we all understand to mean that, whether it's calling for jihad, which we saw, since October the 7th, and the police told us, the Metropolitan Police told us jihad can have many meanings. Um, whether it, and then, this attack was carried out by a guy called Jihad, the guy whose name translates as jihad from Syria, who carried out jihad in Manchester. I mean, it's almost laughable, but of course it's not laughable because of what happened. So the hate marches, the cries of Khyber, Khyber, Ya Yahud during those, which refers to the Battle of Khyber, where the army of Muhammad slaughtered Jews and raped Sophia, the Jewess, as a sort of trophy. These sorts of things shouldn't be happening on our streets. We Jews certainly understand what they mean. From the river to the sea, globalize the Intifada being a wave of terror attacks targeted at killing Jews. So why would you permit people to shout globalize the Intifada on our streets? So all of those things, but at the same time also the ludicrous and outrageous media portrayal, both of what's going on in Israel, especially during the war, and what's going on in Gaza. But even previous to that, for many years or decades, especially on places like the BBC, but also on channels like Sky News, which I love to remind people, if you can make yourself watch it for over an hour or two, you'll see every so often the weather forecast break bumpers say the weather forecast is sponsored by Qatar Airways. So you do ask yourself, like, how people can miss the elephant in the room, how people can miss the calumnies, the lies, the misinformation, the twisting, the distortion of what's going on, when in today's world you actually can find plenty of sources which will give you an honest and fair version of what's going on in that part of the world. And it may be ugly what's happening, but it's ugly because it's a really horrible war against a really ugly enemy. And the only way to deal with that is unfortunately quite brutal, and involves really horrible war. I'm not pro-war. I'm not, as people keep accusing some of us, pro-genocide. But I don't consider that there is a genocide being carried out by Israel. I do consider that there was a genocide or attempted genocide carried out against the Jews on October the 7th, and since, and that's because Hamas have made it very clear that they were genocidal in intent. So all of those things, and they filtered through to all other parts of society. I think so many of our institutions have been captured by those who either knowingly or unknowingly basically push a terrorist agenda, a terrorist narrative, and therefore an anti-Israel and anti-Jewish narrative, and that naturally will have worn off on society and made both well-meaning people and much less well-meaning people, like the jihad guy, feel that they can express this anti-Semitism either verbally or in their behavior or through killing Jews. And that really, I think, is, in summary, how we got to this horrible position where now Jewish people know that they can be killed in the UK at prayer in a synagogue.
Yeah, it's a shameful situation where in the 21st century, in this supposedly equity-friendly country, Jews feel they are not safe. And that is something that should give everyone in this country pause for thought. One thing that's really struck me in the fallout from the Manchester atrocity is that the left and certain sections of the liberal elite, they see incitement everywhere. They see it, they will say that J.K. Rowling is responsible for violence against trans people just because she thinks men are not women. Or if the Daily Mail publishes an editorial saying that immigration is out of control, they will say that's causing violence and hatred against migrants and so on. They see incitement everywhere. But when it comes to this question, they think it's absolutely fine to march through the streets every weekend for 2 years calling for the destruction of the Jewish state, in some cases, the killing of Jewish people with the chance for the army of Muhammad to return, calling for jihad, open calls for holy war against the world's only Jewish nation. Apparently, that kind of commentary has no consequences whatsoever. That's never incitement, and you will really get hauled over the coals if you suggest there is any link between that and what happened in Manchester. But of course, one of the arguments they make is that there is a difference between what we're doing, because we're only expressing anger with Israel, and with what Jihad al-Shami did in Manchester, because he expressed anger and, in fact, a murderous hatred for Jews. Now, I'm not buying this distinction anymore, but what is your response to that when they say all we do is criticize the Jewish state, we don't hate Jewish people?
I think there's two elements to that, and basically I agree with everything you just said, unsurprisingly. But there's two elements to that in my mind, and one is that when there are, as I mentioned, chants of Khyber Khyber or um, globalize the Intifada, or there are plenty of other chants which are explicitly anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish, explicitly bloodthirsty, or about death. I mean, even the BBC broadcasting death, death to the IDF. Yes, it's an Israeli army. Yes, you might not like what they're doing. You might even have the misguided opinion that they're carrying out a sort of barbaric genocide aimed solely at children in Gaza, all of that. But chanting death at a music festival, I mean, again, the irony when the last actual death at a music festival that I'm aware of was at the Nova Festival in Israel, when the Palestinians invaded Israel and raped and killed and kidnapped people who were at a music festival. So those sorts of chants, both in the protests on the streets, in stickers all over the place, at music festivals, those are explicitly about killing Jews. But beyond that, I also think that the obsession, the actual obsessive focus, ought to make people who are caught up in that think twice. So of course, like, we're all human, and I think that if you're socially minded and you look at the news and you do get sad about things that are going on in the world, it may be natural that you want to express your dissatisfaction or sadness at certain things happening around the world. But if you find yourself predominantly or exclusively obsessing on one injustice, perceived injustice in the world, but also not just only focusing on that one, but doing it all of the time and making it central to your identity, i.e., you must wear a sort of terrorist keffiyeh, and you must wave the flag at every opportunity of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, and you must put it on your dating profile on an app. And if you can't, you should find a symbol like a watermelon, which is like a shibboleth for others, to code that this is what you are. It's basically your entire identity. I went to the gym the other day, and there was a young girl on a treadmill in the gym, and she had unfurled a PLO flag across the front of the treadmill. while she was in the gym, and she was kitted out in full like Palestine clothes and earrings and jewelry. And I mean, I just looked at that and I thought, why? Why do you need to unfurl a flag on the treadmill in the gym in London? Like, what's it got to do with anything? I don't go to the gym and express political opinions or thoughts on geopolitics. I go to the gym to work out, as I guess she might have done. So when I look at things like that, those sorts of behaviors make it totally clear to me that the obsession is unhealthy and symptomatic of something far worse. And so if you find yourself engaged in that kind of behavior, fair dues, you might have got there unintentionally, but you would think that when someone holds a mirror up to it and says, "Isn't this a bit strange?" you would have the self-awareness to consider that, yes, it is. And one such mirror might be when a guy goes to a synagogue and kills Jews. Um, I think that it's really hard now for people to deny these connections and links. And as you said, we live in an age where actually we're meant to be sort of obsessively cautious of other people's feelings, and I'm not really a subscriber to a lot of that, but there is a huge hypocrisy, in the whole BLM movement. I would tell people that I don't think I am racist, and they would tell me that that in itself made me racist because I can't understand how I'm actually racist inherently and unintentionally. And the more I would say I really don't think I am racist, they would say, well, that even more proof that you are. So, and yet they can't turn that around on themselves in this instance. So I think that it's really symptomatic of the era that we're living in. I agree, and I think it's very interesting that this seems to be the one thing, hating Jews, hating the Jewish state, obsessing on those things, that they just can't uh, see this in.
Yeah, I remember the slogan from the BLM years was "Silence is violence." So even if you said nothing at all about black people's predicament, that in itself was an act of violence. And yet, these very same people have been completely silent about the spike in anti-Jewish hate crimes over the past 2 years in particular. They've said nothing as, excrement was smeared on synagogues around Golders Green, or Jewish kids were allowed to take off their blazers so no one would know that they were Jews, or, that 500% rise or whatever it was, very high rise in anti-Jewish incidents. They said nothing about it. They turned the other way. And I think that was one of the incremental things that led to a situation where someone like Jihad al-Shami thinks, well, no one cares. We can do what we want with these evil people. Sticking with Manchester for a minute, I wanted to ask you about the day itself, because I mean, it was a horrible day for Britain's Jews, and us friends of British Jews felt it as well. I was in Dublin, and I was also writing that day, and I was writing in a cafe in Dublin. As I was writing my piece, a pro-Palestine demonstration went past, screaming "From the river to the sea," and I was incredibly angry when I saw that. I thought, they're killing Jews over the Irish Sea, and here you are calling for the destruction of the Jewish nation. It just felt horrible. And of course, the same thing happened here in Britain. People were on the streets that day. They were chanting the usual slogans. And then subsequently on Saturday in London, we saw the pro-Palestine Action demonstration at which people were shouting, "Long live the Intifada." And as you've said, Intifada means violence against Jews. What do you think that fallout tells us? Part of me thinks it's just confirmation that these are not good people. But another part of me wonders if perhaps these people are feeling increasingly cornered and desperate, because I do think there is a dawning realization in certain sections of society that all of this stuff might have gone a bit too far. What do you think is the temperature of the country after the Manchester attack?
Yeah, well, I mean, I read your piece after the attack, and I think I sent you a message actually because I think it was great, and it shouldn't matter if a commentator is Jewish or not, but of course Jews do really feel the support because it's sadly so rare, and so it does matter. And I think that the whole point is that what you just said there, it might have gone a bit far. What an understatement. So I think that, yeah, it might have gone a bit far when you got two dead Jews killed at synagogue on Yom Kippur, and yet they still don't see it, as you said, the same time, the next day, more of the same. And in fact, this was a really interesting one for me because I saw this. I was asked on um, another news interview. Oh, they've asked them not to do their protest this week as a sort of sensitivity thing after what happened to the Jews. I was like, this week? What will it be okay next week? Was it okay last week? I mean, if it's just about sensitivity, spare me. I'm not sure I care if you do it this week or if you do it next week. If you're going to dance on their graves effectively, well, yeah, go ahead, do it before they're even buried. So I think that the reality is it's very hard to climb down when you're so passionately and uh, personally involved in a cause, whatever that cause is. And I think that's another symptom of the malaise of our time, which is especially for younger people who are pushed by their peers and by the algorithms of social media and the like to have an opinion on things they may not understand very well, but they're pushed to feel socially aware, to feel socially responsible in a sort of international way. And then they get their information often from really insufficiently detailed or accurate or truthful places in very short bursts. And they rely on herd mentality or tribal behavior or following celebrities or whatever it might be to try to find their position. And then they make it a fundamental part of their day to day identity. So that, for example, they unfurl a flag at the gym. And yeah, it's going to be difficult for them to climb down, even if you show them two dead Jews and you can draw the line between what they're doing and that happening. I think it's extremely difficult to expect people to climb down from that. So I am interested as a writer and as a commentator in not trying to be defeatist. Like if I can help people understand that how that behavior got us to this point, I would rather that they do get it and that we give them the space and the sympathy maybe is a bit strong a word, but just the opportunity to think about it and not to have to be shamed or disgraced for it. Um, there are people who perhaps deserve to be shamed and disgraced for it, perhaps the ones doing the manipulations. But regardless, I always say, Jews are less than 0.5%, I think, of the population in this country. Most people probably haven't met Jews in the UK, and especially outside places like London or Leeds. So it's understandable maybe if people have no idea what Jews are and they end up believing stereotypical caricatures because that's what they're fed. So I'm always quite forgiving if I feel like the misunderstandings are not deliberate. But I do hope that people are open-minded enough to then figure things out when there's a big enough shock to the system that they maybe broaden their input. And I will say this actually, I get quite a lot of feedback from people I know and don't know for what I do, as I'm sure you do. And actually, most of it most of the in-person reactions where people actually talk to you in the street or people write to you specifically rather than leaving a comment on an open site are actually, I find, very sympathetic and increasingly interested in understanding things better, which I consider to be a very positive thing. And then when I look at things like the Unite the Kingdom march, which I also went to cover for The Spectator, people there knew that I was there. I was there with my husband, who I also work with, and covering it. And they saw that we were Jewish. He decided to wear a kippah on his head. So he wanted everyone there to know he was Jewish. And actually, the response was exclusively positive from strangers to that. The only abuse he received was on the way home afterwards from somebody from the Antifa, the so-called anti-fascist pro-immigration march, abused him on the way home, which was just like, it was almost like a sitcom, that's who abused a non-white Jewish gay immigrant to the country. He got homophobic, anti-Semitic abuse on the way home from the so-called anti-racist, anti-fascist, pro-immigration people. So I do find that there is potentially a vast current, untapped current of support for getting this right in the country. I just wish it could kind of find its voice without people having to be killed first.
Yeah, absolutely. And extraordinary to think that you were safe among the so-called fascists and not safe with the anti-fascists. I mean, I think that pretty much sums up how twisted all that terminology has become. I did want to ask you about the normalization of security around Britain's Jews, around synagogues, Jewish schools, Jewish institutions. Of course, we see the same thing in Europe as well, especially in France. if you're ever in Paris and you walk past a building and there's armed men outside, you just know that it's a Jewish school or a Jewish museum or something like that. Um, the night before we're recording this podcast, I did an event with Jake Wallace-Simons at a synagogue in northwest London. Wonderful event. Loads of people showed up. I think they wanted a space in which they could talk about what had happened in Manchester and the fallout from that. But I was so struck because not only were there CST security guys on the door checking everyone, there was also a police car outside. There were 2 police officers watching everyone going in, keeping a close eye. And I just thought, how did we get to a situation where this is normal? I mean, obviously it's not normal, but it's become pervasive. And it made me feel uncomfortable. And I can only imagine the impact it has on Jews who must see it every time they go to synagogue or when they drop their kids off at school. How long has that kind of securitization been going on for? And what impact does it have, I guess, on the mentality of the Jewish community when they feel that that kind of stuff is necessary, and it is necessary?
But pretty much all of my life, I'll say. And interestingly, it's spread. I went to the theatre the other day to go and see a production of Oscar Wilde's Salome, which was being put on by the Gesher Theatre Company. It's actually an Israeli-Russian origin theatre company in Israel who are touring their production here. It was brilliant, but there was security outside this theatre in the West End. Now, this isn't even a Jewish event. They had metal crowd control gates around the whole of the front of the theatre so that you couldn't, normally these West End theatres, you can enter through all the doors at the front. There was like one crack in this gate that you could go through. They had a handheld metal detector. They checked for our bags. We all know why. It's because it was an Israeli theatre company. In fact, on the way home, I decided to Google the reviews just to see if others had liked it. They were predominantly negative. I don't know if that's because it was Israeli, but the Guardian review actually started with something like, is it ethical to bring an Israeli production to the West End? Or something along those lines. I just stopped reading there and it had a 1-star review, obviously. I mean, these things are patently ridiculous. But when it comes to the security, yeah, we've had it forever. I mean, it's increased over the years, but not recent years. When I was a child going to the same synagogue I go to now, there was some security. But as I got older, into teenage years, they kind of built a little shed in the courtyard of the synagogue to do security checks from. And then that became a brick building at least 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. And that's now a reinforced brick building, and there's cameras all over the place. And it's normal for us, actually. We consider it normal. Jewish schools, Jewish community centres, when they built the Jewish community centre in London, in Finchley Road. I remember when they built it, they made this special building, brand new community arts and culture centre. Quite a modern building, but it's really unusual looking because it's set back from the road and there's literally like a drawbridge. There's a bridge between the pavement and the building, and they've designed it as elegantly as they can, but it's literally like a medieval fortress, that there's a bridge to get there, and there's like a reinforced glass wall instead of a fence around the perimeter and concrete down the side. That's not normal, even though we've all got used to it. But you can't accuse us of having been overly cautious, I think. It's there for a reason. And that reason became apparent with this attack. But it was apparent before, because these attacks have taken place across Europe and across the world on Jews. In America, where they've got easier access to guns, Jews have been shot outside Jewish locations. In France, Jews have been killed for decades, actually, either individually or in places like Jewish schools. I think there was the Brussels Jewish Museum some years ago. As I mentioned, the hypercache attack. It was a kosher supermarket. I think, yeah, of course we had security, and of course we still do. And we even have this body, the Community Security Trust, this massive volunteer organization and charity, which provides volunteer trained security guards for all Jewish events.
Yeah.
It's an amazing thing that the
Yeah.
community does for itself, but how depressing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I speak at synagogues and other places sometimes, occasionally, whenever I'm asked, of course. And it's always shocking to me to see it. It's just, if I go into a Catholic church, you don't see anything like this. You go to a synagogue and you see police officers or certainly CST security guards. It's really extraordinary.
But I have to say, maybe you should, because there have been Islamist attacks in churches. And I'm sorry to say it, but in the same way that we Jews have been expecting this on a synagogue for a long time, now somebody said to me, well, how long is it going to be till it's a Jewish school? And I will say the same to everyone else. How long is it going to be before it's a church? Unfortunately, the security is important, but I think what would be far more useful is if we could deal with the cause rather than the symptom. So we can't get rid of the security till we've dealt with it. But the impunity with which certain extremist Islamic preachers preach in mosques in the UK. I remember Talk TV made a montage since October the 7th, some like months ago, probably over a year ago, of some of the Friday sermons in which they were literally preaching for the death of Jews. I just thought to myself, well, surely they're going to go into those mosques now and arrest the imams, and certainly then when we saw that Lucy Connolly got arrested for a tweet in which she said, they can burn down the mosques for all I care, um, and got put in prison. And yet the people inside some mosques preaching to a congregation who actually are meant to listen to what their religious leader says, unlike this woman who was not a religious leader or somebody influential over a group of people who would take her spiritual guidance. If they're preaching for the death of Jews inside a mosque, nothing. I don't know of one case where they've been arrested and imprisoned in this country.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I'm a firm supporter of freedom of religion, but it's not an absolute freedom. And even John Locke made this point 500 years ago, that where the exercise of your freedom of religion runs counter to society's own values, then there's a problem. And of course, people inciting hatred or murder of Jewish people runs very much counter, or one would hope it does, to the values of British society. I want to ask you about, you've mentioned Starmer's government, and I want to ask you about Starmer, Lammy, Britain's approach to the Israel question, because of course, the other reason I really wanted to speak to you this week is because it's the second anniversary of the 7th of October pogrom. Part of me thinks things might be improving a little bit in Britain, to the extent that I think more people are asking questions about why there's been so much hatred for Israel. I get this sense that it's making people a bit more uncomfortable. And we've seen people take down the Palestine flag, replace it with the Union flag. There's a new football chant, shove your Palestine up your arse. That, there are little things like that which I think are quite interesting, although obviously one wouldn't want to get overexcited about it. But then there's the depressing stuff, and you've already touched on it, which is the Starmer government's anti-Israel foreign policy, and particularly as expressed in the recognition of the state of Palestine. What role do you think those kinds of political decisions, those kind of foreign policies play in terms of making life harder, I guess, for Jews in the United Kingdom?
Well, that football chant actually, as far as I know, originates in Iran, where they used to chant that at the football in defiance of the Islamic Republic regime there that persecutes its own people and sponsors terrorism through its proxies, including Hamas and others in the Gaza Strip. So I think that the fact that it is spreading here is interesting, and it shows that it is maybe having an effect, because the Iranians I know here actually are some of the loudest prophets of warning about what happens when extremist Islamic terrorism and extremist Islamic views can seize parts of our society and eventually even the whole of society in their case. So I think that's important. And yes, it is, the second anniversary around now of that horrific invasion of the Palestinians into southern Israel and the start of the war that ensued. So it is a moment to think about that. What's interesting about all of this, I think that people in the UK are getting sick of it, as you point out, perhaps because I think they're starting to realize that doesn't really have to be about Israel or Jews. That's the point. I don't really expect most people who haven't got a connection to Israel or Jews to just human nature, I guess. I don't expect them to be that interested. I wish they were. And the main reason I wish they were is actually not just selfish. It's because I wish they'd understand that it has an impact on their own lives. So if the other side, let's say, and I don't want to make it like a football match, but if the other side of this phenomenon has this massive interest in a part of the world that has nothing to do with most of the followers of that ideology, let's call it Palestinianism, as people do so much today, then you might wonder what those people are really interested in. I don't think it is anything to do with the Middle East, with Israel, with Palestinians. I think it's become a sort of code word, and a code movement for a much broader phenomenon, which is the disruption of our social norms here to kind of create chaos. And the same way that Just Stop Oil and other environmental radical groups did what they did, and as we mentioned, BLM and even the trans movement, all of these, I think, have in common a kind of focus on disrupting society and doing so in a way that undermines the basic norms and ideas that tend to hold up our, well, what I would consider to be our culture or our way of being. And that's why I think you find these weird combinations of people, the LGBTQ plus for Palestine, even though they'll literally be slaughtered if there was such a place as Palestine and they went there and behaved as they do here. So I think that British people are realizing that the threat is much bigger, and that if Israel and Jews are at threat in this way, it's going to have a knock-on effect. And it's interesting that they are realizing it because, as I mentioned, Manchester Arena for me is it's a big comparison point. Um, it was a much bigger terror attack in a sense than what happened in the synagogue, and yet people seem to have sort of forgotten about it, like every other terror attack over my lifetime. They kind of wave their balloons and put teddies out and say, "Don't look back in anger." But I think maybe we should look back and forwards in anger at the people that are doing this to our society. I think a bit of anger actually is what's in order, and not anger to create violence, not anger to disrupt, but anger to just say, actually, it's enough. Like, of course, we're angry. And when I saw Lammy go and try to make that disastrous speech to the people gathered, in Manchester after the attack at the synagogue, and he was heckled, and I was so proud of those people heckling him because it takes a lot, I think, to make the Jewish community I know in this country do something like that. And yet they didn't swear. They didn't throw anything. There was no violence, no punches thrown. They just made their grief and anguish explicit. They vocalized how they felt about what he was saying and what the government was doing and had done. And if you compare that to the protests that are claiming to show dissatisfaction with the government for its position on Israel's war, it was completely different. It was a civilized group of people expressing pain and sadness and anguish. So I think that's one of the reasons why people are starting to realize it. And I think it goes hand in hand with movements like Unite the Kingdom, which, far from being, in my experience of going there, far from being a far right Nazi fascist rally, it was a massive mobilization of mostly, from what I saw, very regular British people who are actually quite concerned about the challenges to British culture and the British way of life, but also very proud of their Britishness and wanting to celebrate it in a public way together. And even looking at that, I mentioned the behavior of the Jewish people heckling Lammy. Look at the behavior of that rally. I think there were, I can't remember, 28 arrests or something they said. Look how many arrests there are at your average so-called pro-Palestine, anti-Israel protest at the moment. I think 400, 500 in the last one, 60s at other time, and they're minuscule in comparison, the size. So actually, it really makes you wonder how the government feels it can call the United Kingdom style movement a fascist, violent, divisive one. And the other side, they've bent over backwards to facilitate its repeated and constant disruption of normal people's lives. And the last bit to add as well for me is that I'm all for freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom of protest. They're all important things. But of course, like all our freedoms, we accept limitations on them for the purposes of our communal safety and what have you. Where we draw that line might differ between different people. But when it comes to it, it seems that has been completely taken advantage of by certain movements who don't just want to express themselves, they want to inconvenience, disrupt, and bully and intimidate other people. And that's very anti democratic, in my opinion. So, by all means, express your political views, even if I massively disagree with them, but glue yourself to things or get in the way of ambulances or intimidate Jewish people or just regular other Brits. And you're not doing that. You're bullying and intimidating. And in that respect, I think one thing we've forgotten a bit in many of our democracies is that sometimes the majority needs defending from the minority. And through our tolerance and championing of our freedoms to express ourselves, we sometimes forget that minorities can be actually very intimidating to majorities. And I think that those people are a minority in this country, but we've allowed them to become massively intimidating and threatening. And I just think it's so obvious that needs to be changed somehow.
It's so true what you say about the double standards on these different kinds of marches as well, because, I've seen with my own eyes people chanting for the death of Jews or calling Jews Christ killers or saying that the Jewish nation should be violently erased. And it wasn't on the Unite the Kingdom marches that I saw those anti-Semitic cries. It was on the other marches. So there's such an extraordinary amount of hypocrisy in the way in which these different kinds of demonstrations are talked about. Um, I did want to, just on the 7th of October question, I wanted to kind of bring you back to, I guess, the 8th of October, 2023, and the response to what happened. And there is a tendency, I think, to, not amongst people like you and me and people we know, but certainly in broader society, I think there is a desire to forget what happened after 7th of October, which is that people celebrated the pogrom outside the Israeli embassy. They were dancing and singing. Leftists refer to it as a day of celebration, an act of resistance. They said it was something that we should cherish. Um, Even, certain kind of people who present themselves as, the representative of the moral conscience of Britain, liberal commentators or liberal spokespeople, either said nothing or made excuses or kind of looked the other way. I mean, that's something that we also can't forget, isn't it? I mean, we obviously cannot forget 7th of October, and there will be commemorations this week on the second anniversary, but we can't forget what 7th of October gave rise to here in our own society.
Right. And we've, talked about that. You and I have talked about that before, and lots of people have talked about it since. I mean, it's in your excellent book that you wrote afterwards and others as well. Without wanting to cover sort of old ground in that respect, yes, I completely agree. And yet I would also say that, I don't think it was a kind of 8th of October thing, because those of us, yourself included, who've covered this kind of part of society's behavior have actually seen it before. So I remember, I can't even remember how many years ago now, I sat through a court case it was a weird case where there'd been one of these events on a university campus here in London of, I think it was Israel Apartheid Week. This is years ago, probably 10 or 15 years ago. And there was a small group of people who had protested against the Israel Apartheid Week event outside. And one guy, I think he was an Arab student, came and bit this guy in the face for protesting against the Israel Apartheid Week event. And there was a court case in which, weirdly, they brought charges against both the guy who got bitten and the guy who bit. And eventually they dropped the charges against the guy who got bitten because there was some video footage. But I sat through the trial because I was interested in covering it, and he got let off. Like, that was the point. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, that's probably the first time I remember feeling Jews probably aren't being sufficiently looked after by this country. If the judiciary, if a legal case collapses with what I saw just watching from the public gallery as it was, open and shut, cut and dried, clear case, that this guy had physically attacked somebody, and there was video footage right up until the moment. The reason it stopped is this guy dropped his camera as he was being bitten in the face, and they lied, as far as I remember. Some of the witnesses were shown to have lied, and all of this happened, and yet they were let off. And I thought to myself, well, that's not quite proper. And there have been so many other cases since then. Why do I mention that? Because that's well before October the 7th, 2023. And these kinds of protests, it was called Israel Apartheid Week. The idea of Israel apartheid, the idea of genocide, they started using the word genocide about Israel's response to the October 7th attack, literally on October 7th or 8th. So it certainly can't have been a genocide then. And I, as you know, would argue it's not genocide now, as far as I can see. But that word's been used for years, for decades. I actually saw an interesting montage of press clippings the other day from the last 20 years of examples of when the Palestinian cause had used the word genocide as an allegation against Israel. So they're not even waiting for this war to accuse Israel of genocide. And why accuse Israel of genocide? Because obviously, perhaps the most famous genocide that most of us have in our minds is the Nazi Holocaust, which was perpetrated predominantly against the Jewish people. And so it's part of the Palestinian narrative and cause to try and invert that, to try and say that the Jewish state is carrying out a genocide against Palestinian Arabs, and that indeed Gaza, the Gaza Strip, though it had had the closest thing to Palestinian statehood and self-rule for 20 odd years, actually that was a concentration camp. So these phrases are chosen not accidentally, they're very carefully chosen. So yes, October the 8th saw this sort of gear change, but it was a gear change. Perhaps it went into fourth or fifth gear, but it was certainly not in neutral before then.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good point. Well made. Um, Jonathan, I want to ask you a couple more quick questions before I let you go. On the recognition of Palestine, I want to ask you how significant you think that was. It certainly seems to have angered a lot of Jewish people here in Britain. Definitely angered Israel. A lot of us think it was ridiculous, and of course, the people who were pleased by it were Hamas, who referred to the recognition of Palestine by Starmer and others as one of the fruits of 7th of October. Um, and if we just think about that in relation to the Manchester atrocity, it's all very well for Starmer to condemn what happened in Manchester, and I'm sure he was as horrified by it as the rest of us were. But there are others who consider that Starmer has rewarded anti-Jewish violence previously by giving the gift of a state less than 2 years after the worst act of anti-Jewish violence in two generations. So what do you make of the recognition of Palestine? What impact do you think that will have, not only on events in the Middle East, I guess, but on Britain's position in the moral universe, in global affairs?
I think that it's obviously a bit ridiculous, the recognition, but it's also, it wasn't just Britain. It was shared by a few states, in coordination did this, quite a few and quite a few significant ones, including the UK. I think it is of importance, no doubt about that, because it sends several messages. So one is what you've just said about rewarding Palestinian maximalism, Palestinian commitment to terrorism and violence, and Palestinian rejection of any kind of negotiated path towards peace and coexistence, which could then potentially lead to statehood. But also, I think more importantly, perhaps for most British people, because it shows a British surrender to terrorism generally. So while that wasn't terrorism that specifically targeted Britain itself, it just showed jihadist terrorism. It showed Islamic terrorism that Britain is weak in response. If the right response is tough and difficult, Britain will opt for really not just not taking it, it will opt for reward instead. And there is no question. I don't think Hamas is wrong to have said this is a direct result of the October the 7th attack. I just don't see how anyone else could read it differently, because British government after British government of either party, either of the two main parties, had not recognized a Palestinian state. Then the British government did. So what had changed? What had changed was, I think Starmer, to paraphrase him, would say, well, this war pushed him to do it because he felt that Israel's behavior was such that it was potentially ending the possibility of a Palestinian state. So he was going to recognize it now, to kind of draw a line in the sand. I'll deal in a moment with why that's pretty stupid statesmanship, and stupid diplomatically. But that's a clear answer. Why is there a war now? There's a war now because Hamas started it, and on October the 7th, 2023. So it is October the 7th, 2023, which made the difference between Britain not recognizing a Palestinian state and recognizing it. Now, to move on to the other element of importance, it makes a mockery of recognition of statehood because there is no state to recognize. Lamy said it himself the morning that Starmer announced it in that Sky News interview he did with Trevor Phillips. He said, we're miles away from it even being possible, never mind happening. And he's right, we are. So why recognize something that is literally currently impossible? The answer is, as they made it very clear, to punish Israel. So to recognize a would-be state of a claimed nation, to punish a different state, which it attacked barbarically and continues to hold hostages from. I think that doesn't make sense I mean, it just doesn't make sense on any level. Even the one which I think is truly behind this, which is that the Labour government is terrified of a certain portion of its electorate and a certain portion of its parliamentary party, which held a gun to its head and said, you must do this or you lose our support. That in itself is kind of like a political act of terrorism. It's to say, here's this really utterly unreasonable demand, and if you don't accept it, then that's it. That is terminal for the party. So I think that it's very important on all of those levels. And it's also important because I think it does permanent damage to the UK's position, both in terms of any future negotiations or actions in the Middle East to try to achieve a better situation there, peace or coexistence or even a ceasefire. It just rendered the UK irrelevant because exactly as he was doing it, Starmer must have been aware of Trump's plan, which he then announced, and which then actually the UK said, oh, it praised the plan and it said it was a good idea. Well, how could it? Because it ran contrary to what the UK had decided to do only days before. And days before they had been together here in the UK, and we know that they had a private one-on-one meeting, the two of them, without their aides at Chequers, in which Trump presumably told him something of his intentions. So I do think that in general, it just showed the UK to be weak, showed the UK to be surrendering any influence it might have thought it had. It betrayed Israel, which is meant to be an ally of the UK and which the UK relies on for certain collaborations. I don't think those will necessarily end because Israel is a responsible state actor that will continue to share intelligence and what have you. But I just think it's a disastrous policy all round. And then right at the end of that tale is the effect it has on Jewish people in this country. I do think that the Manchester killing can be linked to that as well.
Yeah, that's very well put. Okay, Jonathan, my last question. You've mentioned it there, which is Trump's peace plan. I think is a pretty comprehensive plan. I think actually parts of it are a little bit soft on Hamas. I think, offers them amnesty if they return their weapons and safe passage to other countries if other countries will take them. But it basically calls for two of the things that people like you and I have been calling for, which is the immediate return of all the hostages and the surrender of Hamas, the decommissioning of Hamas. And I think if we get those two things, that would be good. How hopeful are you that that will happen? And I guess also, what would the consequences be if it were to happen? I mean, as you said earlier, so many people have invested their entire personality, their entire identity into this conflict about which they understand very little. Might there be repercussions if the conflict ends? It's a conflict we all want to end, ideally with the return of the hostages and the end of Hamas. But it could also have global consequences one way or the other. So what's your feeling about the future of the war itself? Do you think the peace plan can work? Do you think it's a good thing?
I think you've touched on a few very interesting and important points there. And one is the idea that people have invested a lot in the status quo. That is to say, there not being peace and there not being two states. And I would say that the so-called two-state movement that claims to want two states has actually got a built-in incentive for there not to be two states, because there are generations of people who've inherited refugee status, a unique feature of Palestinian refugee status. Other refugees don't get counted that way. So the number of Palestinian refugees is multiplying with every generation born. And that means that they are looked after by a UN body, UNRWA, which effectively has a bigger and bigger role in every generation because it gets bigger, and that is many, many people's livelihood. So if you're involved in it's not just an identity issue, it's actually a livelihood issue. If you're a diplomat or a peace industry worker or an aid worker for Palestinian refugees, you are incentivized to continue your existence, to perpetuate the so-called refugee crisis, which means to perpetuate the conflict, which means to perpetuate the non-ending of this, and effectively not to create two states which could coexist peacefully. And so I think that's one of the things Trump has tried to do here. And I think the interesting thing about the Trump plan is that it is very Trumpian. And what do I mean by that? I mean that Trump is famously a few things. One is quite a difficult bully. Another is a showman, i.e., a sort of media performer and manipulator. And the third is a deal maker and sort of businessman. So each of those has played a part in this plan, to my mind, which is he's looking at it as I don't think a silver bullet to fix everything. I think he always looks for forward motion. That's my general perception of how he does things. And he also isn't necessarily a details man in the plan. So the plan is deliberately vague and ambiguous in so many areas because I think that leaves the room for both sides to accept, actually, and then argue about those details. And that's quite an important feature of deal making in very complex situations. You might think the opposite. You might think we need to nail down every detail to make sure it works. But actually, if you do that, one tiny detail can be the downfall of the whole plan. And that's actually what's happened already, which is he made this so-called 21-point plan. Most of those 21 points were almost fantasy, actually. The only ones that really counted were the complete and simultaneous release of all of the hostages alive and dead within 72 hours at the beginning. That bit, yeah, I agree with. And then the rest trickled down from there to this eventual acknowledgement of the, let's say, British and European and Western fantasy of a peaceful Palestinian state coexisting alongside Israel. But it basically was all conditional on the previous steps, which would have them renounce violence and have them decommission weapons and have them have this amnesty for Hamas members and what have you. And it would also involve a sort of total reinvention of the Palestinian Authority and kind of a redefinition of what it is to be Palestinian, in politically speaking, which is to be committed to coexistence and peace and to renounce violence. Now, none of those things are anywhere near happening. But Trump laid them all out, I think, in order to say to the world, well, I'm taking on board what everybody says they want. The many Western countries say they want that. Many Arab countries say they want to take care of the Palestinian people, but not enough to actually help them themselves very often. Israel says it wants security. The Palestinian political movements say they want statehood. So if I take what everybody said and put it down in this kind of fantasy list, but I start with the bits that are non-negotiable, which are release all the hostages, then end the fighting and allow unlimited aid in. Those seem to be the easiest ones for most people to agree on. And I think that's what he's done, and that's where we're at the moment. I do hope that we get all the hostages back. Even that will be at the enormous cost of releasing hundreds, I think nearly 2,000 Palestinian terrorists, some of them horrific, brutal, violent, barbarous terrorists. That is a big problem, and it's a price that Israel is willing to pay to get back even dead hostages. So it's not an easy situation. And the last thing I'll add to it, which I think is an important thing for us to think about going forwards with this deal or not, I don't think it's just Hamas. And I think the obsession on decommissioning Hamas arms, on Hamas's commitment to non-violence or to disbanding or to being eradicated is a distraction. I think we need to look at Palestinianism in general. Even if we get rid of Hamas, there are countless other factions in the Gaza Strip. They're actually all fighting at the moment as a result of Hamas's weakness. Hamas is killing their members. They are killing Hamas members. Um, Hamas will go away, and that will not make the overall cause of Palestinianism peaceful or focused on coexistence with Israel or non-jihadist. It will not fix the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. It will just recast it and reshape it. And I think that's the war Israel's been fighting. It knows that at the end of this war, whatever happens, this won't be fixed. It still exists in the same region. So what Israel's done is take that horrific, horrible attack and use it as an opportunity to reshape the Middle East. And it has really done that. It hasn't fixed any of the problems conclusively or finally, but what it did with Iran was pretty catastrophic for their nuclear plans, and their ballistic missile operations can be fixed by them. What it's done in Lebanon, the same with Hezbollah, but Hezbollah still not totally eradicated. And so there may need to be a return to that theatre. The same all around, even Syria. What's happened in Syria, yes, Assad's gone, but now we have literally a jihadi terrorist in charge with whom Israel is talking, and the West is talking because you have to. But the point is, none of these problems will go away. And specifically on the Palestinian cause, I think it's time that we stopped allowing it just to be entirely romanticized. Of course, there are people who identify as Palestinians in the region who do wish for peaceful coexistence with Israel and just want to get on with their lives. But I think that as a movement politically, I've not encountered any mainstream Palestinian factions or parties who are influential, who actually are dedicated towards anything which could legitimately lead towards an acceptance of Palestinian statehood. And that's a massive problem which just focusing on Hamas doesn't really tackle.
Jonathan, thank you very much.